It's a beautiful day for Canadian words and creativity here at Museum London, and it's also a beautiful occasion for an afternoon with Miriam Toews, great Canadian writer who was one of the distinguished guests at the 2015 edition of the Words Festival. My name is James Reaney, and it's an honor, and I'm sure it's also an honor for my colleague at the Free Press, Ian Gillespie, who will be here later in the afternoon, to be part of Words and to help introduce some of its guests. Please join me in acknowledging the organizers and sponsors of the second edition of Words, the Literary and Creative Arts Festival. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Miriam Toews to Words. She's here to read from one of her works. And like other guests this weekend, she's won a Leacock Award for humor in her fiction, a Governor General's Award, and many others. She's here to read, as I said, talk about her words. There'll be a question and answer, a discussion, and there'll be signing later on in the afternoon. She's written with passion and brilliant craft and marvelous jests about sisters, life and death, marriage and movie making, Mexico, music of all types, the cruel failings of the Canadian mental health system, and almost as remarkably as any of these, Miriam Toews has celebrated the Toronto Blue Jays in the difficult seasons before David Price arrived. Her fictional Canadian Mennonite community of East Village is as real and universal, happy and tragic as other famous such inventions in Canadian writing, Mariposa, Manawanka, and Jubilee among them. This afternoon we'll spend some time in and around East Village, guided by the writer who discovered that community. Once again, please welcome Miriam Toews.
Thanks, James. Thank you. It's great to be here. It's really good. And it's true about the Blue Jays. It's too bad about the Blue Jays. But I was able to go see some playoff games, actually, because my mother, she moved to Toronto and she had season tickets. And then she, in fact, we were renovating her kitchen, and she said, I really want to help you, and my partner, she said, I really want to help you with the cost of that. She lives with us. I should pay for the fridge at least or something like that. And we, and then she said, but here's the thing, I have a confession to make. She said, actually, I just bought $2,000 worth of playoff tickets for the Jays. But it was great. We all benefited for a while until they lost. Okay, I'm going to read from this book, All My Puny Sorrows. It's my most recent book, although it has been out for a while. I've been very busy talking about it, reading from it for the last year and a half, all over the place. This is one of my very final kind of events for a while. It's time for me to go back and write another book. So this is a nice monumental occasion for me too, to sort of cap things off. For a while. I have glasses now. This is a new thing in my life, and I'm so excited. I keep talking about them as though, I've just discovered glasses. You guys should try them out. And I've always wanted to have reading glasses, so now I finally have them. I love them. I just love them. But they don't fit me very. They keep sliding off. So. Okay. I'll read from the first this book for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. It's a book about sisters. One of whom very much wishes to die, and the other who very much wants to keep her alive. And it's written from the younger sister's point of view, the one who wants to keep the older sister alive, and also has to come to some kind of realization, some understanding of what it means to love somebody who wants to die. Where do our obligations lie, and where does that person's rights where do they begin? So I'm going to read from chapter 1. Our house was taken away on the back of a truck one afternoon late in the summer of 1979. My parents and my older sister and I stood in the middle of the street and watched it disappear. A low-slung bungalow made of wood and brick and plaster, slowly making its way down First Street, past the A&W and the deluxe bowling lanes, and out onto the number 12 highway, where we eventually lost sight of it. "I can still see it," said my sister Elfrida repeatedly, until finally she couldn't. "I can still see it. I can still see it. I can still... Okay, nope, it's gone," she said. My father had built it himself back when he had a new bride, both of them barely 20 years old, and a dream. My mother told Elfrida and me that she and my father were so young and so exploding with energy that on hot evenings, just as soon as my father had finished teaching school for the day, and my mother had finished the baking and everything else, they'd go running through the sprinkler in their new front yard, whooping and leaping, completely oblivious to the stares and consternation of their older neighbors, who thought it unbecoming of a newly married Mennonite couple to be cavorting, half-dressed, in full view of the entire town. Years later, Elfrida would describe the scene as my parents' La Dolce Vita moment, and the sprinkler as their Trevi fountain. "Where's it going?" I asked my father. We stood in the center of the road. The house was gone. My father made a visor with his hand to block the sun's glare. "I don't know," he said. He didn't want to know. Elfrida and my mother and I got into our car and waited for my father to join us. He stood looking at emptiness for what seemed like an eternity to me. Elfrida complained that the backs of her legs were burning up on the hot plastic seat. Finally, my mother reached over and honked the horn, only slightly, not enough to startle my father, but to make him turn and look at us. It was such a hot summer, and we had a few days to kill before we could move into our new house, which was similar to our old house, but not one that my father had built himself with loving attention to every detail, such as a long covered porch to sit in and watch electrical storms while remaining dry. And so my parents decided we should go camping in the Badlands of South Dakota. We spent the whole time, it seemed, setting everything up and then tearing it all down. My sister, Elfrida, said it wasn't really life. It was like being in a mental hospital where everyone walked around with the sole purpose of surviving and conserving energy. It was like being in a refugee camp. It was a halfway house for recovering neurotics. It was this and that. She didn't like camping. And our mother said, "Well, honey, it's meant to alter our perception of things." "Paris would do that too," said Elf, or LSD. And our mother said, "Come on, the point is we're all together. Let's cook our wieners." The propane stove had an oil leak and exploded into 4-foot flames and charred the picnic table. But while that was happening, Elfrida danced around the fire singing "Seasons in the Sun" by Terry Jacks, a song about a black sheep saying goodbye to everyone because he's dying. And our father swore for the first recorded time, "What in the Sam Hills?" and stood close to the fire, poised to do something, but what? And our mother stood there shaking, laughing, unable to speak. I yelled at my family to move away from the fire, but nobody moved an inch, as if they had been placed in their positions by a movie director, and the fire was only fake, and the scene would be ruined if they moved. Then I grabbed the half-empty rainbow ice cream pail that was sitting on the picnic table and ran across the field to a communal tap and filled the pail with water and ran back and threw the water onto the flames, which leapt higher then, mingled with the scents of vanilla chocolate and strawberry, towards the branches of an overhanging poplar tree. A branch sparked into fire, but only briefly, because by then the skies had darkened, and suddenly rain and hail began their own swift assault, and we were finally safe, at least from fire. That evening, after the storm had passed and the faulty propane stove had been tossed into a giant cougar-proof garbage cage, my father and my sister decided to attend a lecture on what was once thought to be the extinct black-footed ferret. It was being held in the amphitheater of the campground, and they said they might stick around for the second lecture as well, which was being given by an expert in astrophysics about the nature of dark matter. "What is that?" I asked my sister, and she said she didn't know, but she thought it constituted a large part of the universe. "You can't see it," she said, "but you can feel its effects or something." "Is it evil?" I asked her. She laughed, and I remember perfectly, or should I say I have a perfect memory, of how she looked standing there in her hot pants and striped halter top with the shadowy, eroded Badlands behind her head back, way back, her long, thin neck and its white leather choker with the blue bead in the center. Her burst of laughter, like a volley of warning shots, a challenge to the world to come and get her if it dared. She and my father walked off towards the amphitheater, my mother calling out to them, "Make kissing sounds to ward off rattlesnakes." And while they were gone, and learning about invisible forces and extinction, my mother and I stayed beside the tent and played What Time Is It, Mr. Wolf, against the last remaining blotches of the setting sun. On the way home from the campground, we were quiet. We had driven for 2.5 days in a strange direction that took us away from East Village until finally my father had said, "Well, fair enough. I suppose we ought to return home now," as though he had been trying to work something out and then had simply given up. We sat in the car looking solemnly through open windows at the dark, jagged outcroppings of the Great Canadian Shield. "Unforgiving," said my father, almost imperceptibly. And when my mother asked him what he had said, he pointed at the rock, and she nodded, "Ah," but without conviction, as though she had hoped he'd meant something else, something they could defy, the two of them. "What are you thinking about?" I whispered to Elf. The wind whipped our hair into a frenzy, hers black, mine yellow. We were in the back seat, stretched out lengthwise, our legs entangled, our backs against the doors. Elf was reading Difficult Loves by Italo Calvino. "If you weren't reading right now, what would you be thinking about?" I asked again. "A revolution," she said. I asked her what she meant, and she said I'd see someday. She couldn't tell me now. "A secret revolution?" I asked her. Then she said in a loud voice so we could all hear her, "Let's not go back." Nobody responded. The wind blew. Nothing changed. My father wanted to stop to see ancient Aboriginal ochre paintings on the rock escarpments that hugged Lake Superior. They had endured mysteriously against the harsh elements of sun and water and time. My father stopped the car, and we walked down a narrow, rocky path towards the lake. There was a sign that said "Danger," and in small letters explained that people had been known to be swept off these rocks by giant rogue waves and that we were responsible for our own safety. We passed several of these signs on our way to the water, and with each dire warning, the already deep furrow in my father's brow became deeper and deeper until my mother told him, "Jake, relax. You'll give yourself a stroke." When we got to the rocky shore, we realized that in order to see the pictographs, one had to inch along slippery, wet granite that plunged several meters into the foamy water, and then hang onto a thick rope that was secured with spikes driven into the rock, and then lean way back over the lake, almost to the point of being horizontal, with your hair grazing the water. "Well," said my father, "we're not about to do that, are we?" He read the plaque next to the trail, hoping that its contents would suffice. "Ah," he said. "The rock researcher who discovered these paintings called them forgotten dreams." My father looked at my mother then. "Did you hear that, Lottie?" he asked. "Forgotten dreams." He took a small notebook from his pocket and wrote down this detail. But Elf was completely enchanted with the idea of suspending her body on a rope over crashing water, and before anybody could stop her, she was gone. My parents called to her to come back, to be careful, to use some common sense, to behave herself, to get back now. And I stood silent and wide-eyed, watching in horror what I believed would be the watery end of my intrepid sister. She clung to the rope and gazed at the paintings. We couldn't see them from where we stood. And then she described to us what she was seeing, which was mostly images of strange, spiny creatures and other cryptic symbols of a proud, prolific nation. When we did, all four of us, arrive back alive in our small town that lay just on the far western side of the rocky shield in the middle of blue and yellow fields, we weren't relieved. We were in our new house now. My father could sit in his lawn chair in the front yard and see, through the trees across the highway to First Street, the empty spot where our old house had been. He hadn't wanted his house to be taken away. It wasn't his idea. But the owner of the car dealership next door wanted the property to expand his parking lot and made all sorts of voluble threats and exerted relentless pressure until finally my father couldn't take it anymore, and he buckled one day and sold it to the car dealer for a song, as my mother put it. "It's just business, Jake," said the car dealer to my father the next Sunday in church. "It's nothing personal." East Village had originated as a godly refuge from the vices of the world, but somehow these two, religion and commerce, had become inextricably linked, and the wealthier the inhabitants of East Village became, the more pious they also became, as though religious devotion was believed to be rewarded with the growth of business and the accumulation of money, and the accumulation of money was believed to be blessed by God, so that when my father objected to selling his home to the car dealer, there was in the air a whiff of accusation, that perhaps by holding out, my father wasn't being a good Christian. This was the implication. And above all, My father wanted to be a good Christian. My mother encouraged him to fight, to tell the car dealer to take a hike, and Elfrida, being older than me and more aware of what was going on, tried to get a petition going amongst the villagers to keep businesses from expanding into people's homes, but there was nothing that could be done to assuage my father's persistent guilt and the feeling that he'd be sinning if he were to fight for what was his in the first place. And besides, my father was thought to be an anomaly in East Village. An oddball, a quiet, depressive, studious guy who went for 10-mile walks in the countryside and believed that reading and writing and reason were the tickets to paradise. My mother would fight for him, although only up to a point, because she was, after all, a loyal Mennonite wife and didn't want to upset the apple cart of domestic hierarchy, but she was a woman anyway, so very easily overlooked. Now, in our new house, my mother was restless and dreamy. My father slammed things around in the garage. I spent my days building volcanoes in the backyard or roaming the outskirts of our town, stalking the perimeter like a caged chimp. And Elf began working on increasing her visibility. She had been inspired by the ochre paintings on the rock, by their impermeability and their mixed message of hope, reverence, defiance, and eternal aloneness. She decided she too would make her mark. She came up with a design that incorporated her initials EVR, Elfrida von Riesen, and below those the initials AMP. Then, like a coiled snake, the letter S, which covered, underlined, and dissected the other letters. She showed me what it looked like on a yellow legal notepad. I said, I don't get it. Well, she told me, the initials of my name are obviously the initials of my name, and the AMP stands for all my puny. Then the big S stands for Soros, which encloses all the other letters. She made a fist with her right hand and punched the open palm of her left hand. She had a habit, then, of punctuating all her stellar ideas with a punch from herself to herself. How'd you come up with it? I asked her. She told me that she'd gotten it from a poem by Samuel Coleridge, who would definitely have been her boyfriend if she'd been born when she should have been born. Or if he had, I said. She told me she was going to paint her symbol on various natural landmarks around our town. What natural landmarks? I asked her. Like the water tower, she said, and fences. May I make a suggestion? I asked. She looked at me askance. We both knew there was nothing I could offer her in the way of making one's mark in the world. That would be like some acolyte of Jesus saying, hey, you managed to feed only 5,000 people with 1 fish and 2 loaves of bread? Well, check this out. But she was feeling magnanimous just then, the excitement of her achievement, and she nodded enthusiastically. Don't use your own initials, I said, because everyone in town will know whose they are, and then the fires of hell will raineth down on us, etc. Our little Mennonite town was against overt symbols of hope and individual signature pieces. Our church pastor once accused Elf of luxuriating in the afflictions of her own wanton emotions, to which she responded, bowing low with an extravagant sweep of her arm, mea culpa, my lord. Back then, Elf was always starting campaigns. She conducted a door-to-door survey to see how many people in town would be interested in changing the name of it from East Village to Shangri-La, and managed to get over 100 signatures by telling people the name was from the Bible and meant a place of no pride. Maybe, she said. I might just write amps with a very large S. It'll be more mysterious, she said, more je ne sais quoi. Precisely, I said. But don't you love it? I do, I said, and your boyfriend Samuel Coleridge would be happy about it too. She made a sudden karate chop slice through the air, and then stared into the distance, as though she'd just heard the far-off rattle of enemy fire. Yeah, she said, like objective sadness, which is something else. Something else than what? I asked her. Yoli, she said, then subjective sadness, obviously. Oh, yeah, I said, obviously. There are still red spray-painted ampses in East Village today, although they are fading. They are fading faster than the hardy Aboriginal ochre pictographs that inspired them. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Wow, that was fabulous. Now, you've been out on the road with this book, just like a rock band, for, well, something like a rock band. For, is it a year and a half you were saying you've been?
Yes. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've been, this book, I guess, came out in in the spring of 2014, and I have been, very, very busy with, it comes out in different places at different times, so it's been about a year and a half, really, of, touring around
And this, as you were saying, is I think almost the final appearance in Canada for this particular leg of the tour. So thank you for sharing that. That was fabulous. And of course, I should mention too, I don't know if anyone else thought of this, but I think those pictographs may have been worked on by Selwyn Dewdney of London, who was one of the great scholars of certainly that art as well. You'll see, normally we're not supposed to have these things on, but I had a wonderful desire to save paper, so I didn't print out my questions. So they're here on this amazing Canadian invention, the BlackBerry. And I've had some suggest. We'll talk a little bit, and then we'll certainly go to you. And thank you all for being here. It's fabulous to see so many people enjoying this great experience. I wanted to go through and just say there are moments in All My Puny Sorrows when the narrator steps back or away, having just learned something about the nature of writing. And since this is the Words Fest, I'd like to ask you about two of them. And they're both quite interesting segments, of course, fascinating, complex segments in the book. I think the main thing he said is that it should really rock. And this is then Jason, I think, talking to the narrator and advising her on the nature of fiction. I learned another thing, which is just because someone is eating the ashes of your protagonist doesn't mean you should stop telling the story. Are these rules, and we may know part of the answer already having just heard you read, that you write by? And what are some others you might learn from your characters or the story yourself as you put these fictional moments in and how to write moments in?
That's a good, those, Yolandi, the protagonist, is a writer. She writes these the rodeo series for young adult called Rodeo Rhonda, the Rodeo Rhonda series, and they're not doing very well. But she's in the process of trying to write a different kind of book. So she's kind of thinking at times about the act or the art of writing, in addition to all of the other really far more important things that she's thinking about. And I think I guess what those two sections that you describe basically mean in a word is urgency and the necessity of writing. And I feel certainly that's I like to let myself build up a kind of head of steam, like by doing other things, procrastinating, and until finally it just becomes just absolutely imperative that I write again. Or my head will explode, maybe literally. So I think Yolandi and I are both looking to find that sense of purpose and urgency to make any creative act, even living, less futile.
With a novel this personal, I think we can see where the urgency came from, but was it difficult to contain that and to shape it into what you wanted to say as the?
Yeah, because my own sister died in 2010, and at that point I thought, well, I'll never write again. I'm done. I don't have words. I didn't have anything left, let alone any ability to shape narrative. And I did have a book that came out in 2011, but that book had already been finished, so I wasn't working on it. It was just kind of waiting in the can, as it were, to be released. But then when it finally occurred to me, I guess the grief subsided a little bit, and I was able to think again creatively, and my life came back to me, and my mind, and my heart, and I realized that this was a story that I absolutely needed to tell and would tell. Our stories choose us, and after I knew that, when it became certain in my mind and clear to me, then the writing, it certainly was a very fast and kind of pedal to the metal experience, really.
And that's one of the phrases I think that Jason uses, pedal to the metal.
I'm just plagiarizing my own characters.
No, it's self-referential or something. I used to be in grad school. I think I remember this. I've got a trick question, and we talked about this a little bit before. This is a very successful book for you personally, but also for all of us here. But one of the things you said is that there may only be 2 people who read one of your other works. And who are those 2 people, and what is the work? And talk about that a little bit, because it's one we spoke about before, where it.
Yeah, my mother and my editor, or I'm not sure.
I think in one of the Guardian, a writer for the Guardian. I think Alice O'Keefe had also. But talk a little bit about that experience, which is.
I think you're referring to Irma Voth,
That is
which
the
was
one.
my last book, the one that did come out in 2011, right after my sister died. There may have been more than 2 people, but it was a book that, just didn't, it just wasn't read, as far as I know. It seems not to have been as much as, some of my other books, including this one and other ones. But and it was always, I know, some people say that it was their favorite book of mine, and other people, different people say different things about their favorite book, and I'm always curious about that. What are the reasons? I mean, certainly, my books are all one book. They're all part of one big book, which is basically the kind of fictionalized version of my life. And I'm okay with that. I realize that about myself, that that's how I write, that's what I'm doing, and I need to do that. And it's not necessarily, I get asked a lot, well, was it therapeutic for you? Was this a cathartic experience? And of course, obviously it was. I'm a writer, so it's therapeutic for me to write. It feels good, because that's what I need to do. But to write a book, as I'm sure lots of you in this room know, I mean, it's, it requires a kind of distance, in a sense, really a cold, focused, we're crafting narrative and creating something that we hope, is artful. And it's not just an outpouring of emotions like a diary. And so, the distance, a certain distance needed to pass. Anyway, I'm veering off. But Irma Voth, yeah, I mean, that was a book that there were it's a book about sisters in Mexico. It's about old order Mennonites living in Mexico and filmmakers who come to the community to make a film. And the story itself is probably the most plot-driven story that I've ever written. Maybe that's
Good. No, but it was intriguing to hear that too is part of the one big book that you continue to work on, and the next volume will emerge somewhere just down the road. You mentioned the Mennonite communities in Mexico. As you may be aware, there are communities here, especially in Elgin County, of Mennonites with ties to Mexico. I didn't know if you were aware of that, or if that's part of your universe. And I guess specifically, if you knew of a Miriam Toews out there who might be writing about that community, or any.
The Old Order Mennonite community?
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of writers that are in the Old Order community still writing about it, but there are writers for sure, and bloggers and people writing about their experiences in that community. But usually they'll have left as well.
Yeah.
It's I think people generally who stay within these communities, and it's difficult to leave. That's the only world that you know, and it's particularly difficult for women to leave. These are very patriarchal communities. There are a lot of problems. They can be nurturing for some people. But they're religious fundamentalist communities. It's a culture of control and uniformity, and so it's not really a place where you can really be an artist. And I knew that from my own community, leaving my own community, which wasn't an Old Order Mennonite community, but it was a very conservative, religious, fundamentalist community.
We talked about this as well, but one of the ways it seems that there's rebellion or awareness of the outside world or potential is the constant flow of music of all types in your writing. And on one of my favorite pages, there's young lovers are getting together, and there's a conscious decision that if somebody likes Emerson, Lake and Palmer, you might kiss them, but then the young man mentions Lou Reed, and that sort of seals the deal. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of music of all types, really, but specifically pop, punk, that kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. Music. I mean, I'm a big fan of music, film, everything. I use as research, as material, like that I reference it in my work. What you're referring to is from A Complicated Kindness, which is an older book of mine written a long time ago, and it's written from the point of view of a 16-year-old, Nomi Nickel, and so music is a big part of her world, as it was for me then too. and still is, but as a 16-year-old, it can be everything. I mean, it's everything, particularly a 16-year-old living in a community like that in the middle of nowhere. It's a life-saving thing. And so the factions and the cults around, various groups, the cliques around different types of music are very, very strong. And so I think the line was, you might date somebody who listened to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but you wouldn't let him stick his tongue in your mouth or something like that. I can't even remember.
I'm blushing, but I think that's pretty.
I don't know what it is. I can't remember what it is. And Lou Reed, and I'm a huge fan. I mean, I still can't even believe that Lou Reed has died. It's unfathomable. But I think he was a godsend.
Yeah. Just to bring that around, I think there's another description that you and I spoke about, but there's a character who's described as the Mennonite Iggy Pop. And that again, that struck me as the way, it's the way you bring the two worlds together, that in a way how do you connect them? I mean,
it's just the various worlds that I live in, that we all live in, the different things. I'm a Mennonite, but I'm also, I live in downtown Toronto. I'm educated, and yet I come from a fundamentalist background. It's, we're so many things, and so in my books, everything has to go hand in hand and entwined and interconnected, and comedy and tragedy, it's all just one. It's all my reflection of life, my life, and the way that I see the world. And so I think that character is the aunt figure in this book, and she's an older Mennonite woman, but she's tough, and like Iggy Pop.
And you saw Iggy Pop in Toronto fairly recently.
I saw Iggy Pop play a couple of years ago, and so did my mom. She came too. She had a backstage pass too, because friends of mine were also playing on the same bill, but not with Iggy Pop, but earlier in the evening.
Now you're heading back to Toronto just after this, so you were saying you won't be able to be part of the festival from now on, from this pretty much after this, but I asked you if you were staying around, who would you, and had a chance?
Yeah, the festival. I mean, I would love to see Russell Smith and Terry Fallis and Linden MacIntyre and others. Some I'm not familiar with, but it seems like a really a great lineup, a lot of variety, and should be fun. It's really impressive.
Well, we have a great lineup out there, I'm sure, with questions. Can we, at this point, do I rush to the people with the microphone, or somebody, but if you got questions, please. Oh, even better. Here's the baton.
Yeah, maybe you guys can share the microphone. Any questions?
Please let there be questions. I go back to my BlackBerry.
Thank you. I'm not going to try to pretend that I've read everything that you've written. I've read various published pieces. One thing that kind of strikes me is that your main characters often are struggling to be creative and express themselves and write, perhaps, depending on the character. They're also struggling to keep people with them, either keeping them alive, keeping them in the community, or what have you. The interesting thing that I find, though, is that you don't seem to, unless I'm missing something, you don't seem to make your main characters choose between those two things. Do you care to comment on that?
That's interesting. The choose between the idea of like sort of like a writing creative life versus a family.
I guess, yeah. You don't seem to put those things into direct conflict.
Yeah, certainly not. I mean, and again, just in terms of my own life, I've always been supported by my family as a writer. Not financially, although at times, but they've supported me. They've had faith in this road that I've taken, and I've never felt that I can't human beings, my family, are far more important. They're the most important thing to me. I'm not, then they're more important than books, than any kind of creative. Again, I need I need to write because it's the only thing that I can control. When we love and we have our family and our friends in our circle, our people, we love them dearly and we would do anything for them. And we can't control anything that happens in their lives, whatever tragedy, whatever it is. I mean, we might think that we can, but we get to a certain point, I did, where I realized that, that's an illusion. And so for me, I have to be able to take time where I can go to a place that I can control, something in life that I can just direct and escape to. And that is, for me, writing. For other people, other creative people, it is whatever it would be. And again, my kids over time, now they're adults, but in my family, they've respected that need. And they're not diametrically opposed then being present with a family, with kids, having kids. I'm being creative. But a lot of, and then you can be with your people in a very focused way, and then push it all aside, really, and go into your own thoughts and story. And that's been so necessary. That rhythm in life has been so necessary for me. I often think that I kind of just quickly rush and get a book done in between crises in my it's like, okay, everything's relatively calm right now, I can just focus and then I'll go back and, but a lot of women ask me, how do you do what did you, when you decided to have kids? I was very, very young. I'm not sure how much of a, decision it was at the first time, but yeah, it certainly, both are just needs for me. I can't imagine not having both.
Hi. So just now you said I need to write. It's the only thing I can control. And my question is about that I'm a mental health writer and I can write nonfiction about any mental health issue till the cows come home. But it's my dream to write fiction and to think about, when I sit down to write fiction, I don't know the story that's going to come out. And not having control around that scares me. And so I wonder, when you're writing such profound books with such profound feelings in them, do you ever feel like you're losing control when you're writing, or it's a controlled thing, but at the same time, there's this innate sort of creative experience that I know any artist feels, and that's where the magic comes from. And
yeah. I think you really hit the nail on the head, and that it is magical, for lack of a better word. It's magic. I often think of it as that too, and it is a combination, and it seems contradictory, but that combination of control, of the craft of writing, of establishing character and pace and rhythm and tone and setting and details and detail and it's that control combined with a type of loss of control, or a type of faith, a leap of faith. Really, it requires so much faith, where you just sort of are blindly groping in the dark with your story, having faith in your characters, knowing your characters, and moving forward with them until something hopefully becomes clear or clearer. I think it always remains a bit of a mystery. This book to me is a bit of a mystery. All my books are sort of mysterious, and I'm never sure how they actually became books. I mean, I kind of know because of the control part, but then the other part, and I think it's important not to worry about that too much.
thank you.
So you said that you kind of write a book in between crises and you procrastinate until you've kind of got the urge, but how do you go about the process? Do you start with characters or the story? And you said they're not particularly plot driven. So do you kind of wait till it's all there and then just go and sit down, or you're okay, now I'm gonna write a book. What am I gonna write?
It's now I'm gonna write a book. What am I gonna write? That is very much what it is. But there is, I do actually spend a lot of time thinking and planning and writing notes. The actual writing itself is quite fast compared to a lot of friends of mine, who are writers. But yeah, I spend a lot of time taking notes and circling around and around and around and around. When I go back over my notes, my notebooks, I carry notebooks with me all the time, I can see that there have been themes that I've been obsessing over, just obsessing over, and that I keep going back to, and possibly even snippet from scenes that need to be, and I wouldn't even be conscious of it. And so when I go back over those notebooks, I have to take that into consideration. I have to say, okay, this is what I need to write about. Maybe it's not fun or interesting or even deep or who knows what, but it's what I need to write about. And again, that's that question of faith, of having faith. Like, I can see what I need to be writing about. And then knowing the character, the protagonist, the person who's going to take you through that story. You sort of become that person in a sense. You kind of are anyway, but it's like playing a role, acting. It's not even writing about it. It's becoming, So it's really a question of knowing, why am I writing the story? What's the central problem or the central issue here? And then knowing who it is, and the rest kind of hopefully just falls into place. But I spend a lot of time. It's a lot of psychology behind it, trying to understand what it is I need to write about, regardless of what the world needs to read.
I just have a quick question about the way that you write about different communities in your novels. Like, James Reaney mentioned that you write in that great Canadian tradition of the imagined community that's based on a real place. And then in your most recent novel, Winnipeg is such a huge focus of it. And I was just wondering if you could speak about maybe kind of why you chose to write it in that city and kind of what the role of Winnipeg was for the novel. Yeah,
Winnipeg. That's my hometown. Well, it's not my hometown. I have a different hometown that's very much like East Village in the book. That's my Mennonite hometown. But I lived most of my life in Winnipeg, raised my kids in Winnipeg. Was just there yesterday for a week. That's where so much of my life basically has happened. So that's where I said it. And for me, it's a very exotic, vivid, layered, rich place. And I recently was teaching a workshop, and one of the students was writing about characters from communist Poland, and she just said, "Oh, like, I don't even think that nobody's going to find this interesting. Who would want to read about communist Poland? This little, And then I said, well, look, my stuff is always set in Winnipeg. So I happen to think that communist Poland would be fascinating, but I just set my stuff again. I mean, I could pretend, I could say a whole bunch of things, but the reality is that I write what I know, which is such a cliche, but it's just the truth in my case. So that's what I know.
It's so wonderful to see you face to face. I had the delight of teaching A Complicated Kindness to a class of university students. They loved it. And the essay topic most of them wrote about was Nomi's playlist. Because the music adds a whole other narrative strain to it. But what I wanted to ask you about is the way you combine comedy and tragedy, your humor. I can see it now that I see you face to face, how it just comes. And it comes right side by side with really serious, deep, wrenching things. And it's a psychology that I'm curious about, because my family does that. The more tragic things are, the more we laugh. And we don't know whether it's because we're crazy. But I'm wondering how you combine tragedy and comedy as you write, because it just combines so beautifully.
Thanks. About the playlist, people have been sending me playlists from my books, and it's really great. I thank you for that. Thank you for teaching the book. I appreciate that. The comedy and the tragedy. Well, it's again, that's how I see the world. That's how I see the world. It's a tragic place. It's a profoundly tragic place. It's a cruel place. It's cold and difficult, and yet it's also the opposite at times. And it's very funny. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's noteworthy, and this life. And I don't see them as I don't see comedy and tragedy as separate things in my writing. It's one thing. It's my point of view. It's in my viewfinder, and they're together. And I don't use humor as a distraction from the harder things. I wouldn't want anybody to think, okay, now I can take a breath, because for me, there are other places, for sure, the breathtaking places in the narrative where things slow down a little bit, but not that they're funny. It's just another way of telling a story. It's another way into a serious story. And again, it's not a conscious thing. It's just it's the way that I was raised. There was a lot of laughter in my home. There was a lot of riffing on the comedy of life, and there was a lot of heart sorrow. So I think it's just I think I just grew up with those two tracks constantly, and then eventually they just became one.
Miriam, James mentioned earlier a little bit about mental health, and I heard you in August at another Writers' Festival talking a lot about your involvement and your activism and your frustration with the lack of a national mental health policy in Canada, and with your experience with the previous government. And that was only a few weeks after the campaign had started. Are you feeling a little more positive now?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm feeling positive, and I'm optimistic. But I'm optimistic because I know that so many people, Canadians, are desperate for change and desperate for our broken mental health system to be fixed. Because everybody in this room, I know for a fact, has either suffered from or knows somebody who has, and knows the cruelty of mental illness. So I am positive and optimistic, and there's a lot of work to be done. And I have been saying, and I'm going to such lengths to say, that there are individuals within the system who are genuinely compassionate and competent and curious about the human beings that they're treating, but there are many of the others as well, and it's a very, very difficult system to be in as a patient. There's a lot wrong. There's a lot wrong with the system. The infantilization of patients, for instance, the blame, even coming from nurses and doctors themselves, and the fear even that resides within these psychiatric wards in hospitals, fear from the staff about mental health, mental illness, which is understandable. It's terrifying, and the only way it'll become less terrifying is if we talk about it and think about it. And so my activism is really just a tiny. All I'm doing is basically talking about my own experiences, my family's experiences, stuff that comes from the book, if there's this window of opportunity for me, I feel that it's my moral obligation to take it. And so, I certainly am just one of so many hundreds and thousands of people out there who are working so hard to change things.
You're my favorite author, and I love all of your books, and your characters are like friends to me, especially Nomi. Is probably like one of my best friends in a way, because she, like, that book has been there for me through so many different times. And I was wondering, you talk about the balance between how your writing is like an expression of your life and what's going on, and it just comes out of you, and also how it's like something that you actually have to think and focus to make, and in the moment you become the character as you're writing. But I was wondering, after a book is done, what is your relationship with those characters of your other books that you wrote a long time ago?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because and thank you for that. I'm really happy to hear that. those are great. That's a great feeling for me to have. Thank you. my relationship with my characters, I guess because so many of them resemble, that sort of are a kind me in a way, you know, or parts of me as I was at certain points in my life, and I take them on. I feel an affinity. I mean, they're characters, so it's kind of a strange thing. I think that often. I think that these two characters, these sisters in All My Puny Sorrows, are really the same characters that were in A Complicated Kindness. So that Yolandi von Riesen really is a kind of older version of Nomi Nickel. Even though some of the circumstances are different and it's a different story, for me, in my mind, they are the same person. And Elfrida too, her older sister, and Tash, Nomi's older sister. And I feel like that's just kind of what I'm probably going to do for the rest of my life, my so-called career. I'll just write about the same stuff over and over and over again, and just put a different title on it, and and just like.
Maybe that's a point. Brilliant career. Just we'll put, just I think because I think the signing can follow. Will that be? I think. If
Right,
you're,
yeah,
and I think I think there are other people arriving maybe for the next event. I would say, I was struck. I mean, we started this with really a family, as rooted as it was, rootless, and a home being taken away from them, and yet them finding a home again. And that seems to be part of the constant journey in your work. As if you're in this one big book, that there's rootlessness, and yet they're very rooted at the same time, which is a very powerful experience for us all, I think. I was also struck when you talked about Winnipeg, because I think Alice Munro said at one point that Wingham was the most fascinating place in the world. And I mean, well, maybe it's Winnipeg. But thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for these wonderful questions.